Why dictators kill their own allies in the end. The psychology of power turning against itself. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just a political discussion. This is an exploration of something far more disturbing. Why does absolute power often end with paranoia, isolation, and self-destruction? Why did leaders who once trusted loyal allies eventually begin eliminating the very people who helped them rise? History shows a terrifying pattern. In the final stage of authoritarian power, the enemy is no longer outside the regime. The enemy becomes everyone inside it. And that is where collapse begins. Today, we are going to examine the psychological structure behind that collapse, step by step. Not as ideology, not as propaganda, but as a recurring human pattern. Because when power becomes disconnected from reality, the mind itself starts to fracture. Stage 1, distorted information. Every dictatorship begins to decay the moment truth becomes dangerous. At first, the leader does not intentionally reject reality. Instead, the people around him slowly begin manufacturing a safer version of reality. Why? Because fear changes human behavior. Advisors stop reporting facts. Generals stop speaking honestly. Officials learn that survival depends on saying what the leader wants to hear. Near the end of the rule of Nicolae Ceausescu, government insiders repeatedly manipulated polls, statistics, and public reports to create the illusion of overwhelming public support. The purpose was simple: avoid punishment. The result was catastrophic. The regime became blind to the anger building beneath society. The same pattern appeared under Joseph Stalin. Security agencies exaggerated internal threats because loyalty competitions rewarded fear-based reporting. Under Nicolas Maduro, economic collapse was increasingly blamed entirely on foreign sanctions, allowing structural failures inside the system to remain hidden. Truth slowly transformed into performance. And once information becomes performance, reality itself begins disappearing inside the system. Stage 2, catastrophic misjudgment. When leaders consume distorted information long enough, they stop seeing the world as it is. They begin seeing only reflections of their own fears, ambitions, and illusions. Adolf Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse quickly during Operation Barbarossa. Saddam Hussein convinced himself the United States would never fully invade Iraq. Kim Il-sung believed South Korea could be conquered rapidly. Each of these decisions emerged from the same psychological failure. A leader surrounded by filtered information eventually mistakes fantasy for strategic reality. This is the moment when power becomes cognitively trapped. The dictator is no longer governing the real world. He is governing a hallucination. Stage 3, failed policies built on illusions. Bad perception inevitably produces bad policy. During the Great Leap Forward, Mao Zedong trusted fabricated production. Reports from local officials desperate to demonstrate loyalty. The numbers were false, but policy decisions were made as if they were true. The result was one of the deadliest famines in human history. Under Pol Pot, ideological obsession led to forced mass relocation from cities into rural labor systems, producing mass death and social devastation. In Venezuela, increasingly aggressive price controls intensified shortages rather than solving them. This is the core danger of authoritarian psychology. Policies stop responding to reality. They respond to imagined reality. And imagined reality is always fragile. Stage 4, failure becomes structural. At this point, collapse is no longer accidental. It becomes mathematically inevitable. Millions die in famine. Military systems weaken. Economic structures collapse. Fear spreads through every institution. Under Stalin's purges, experienced military leadership was destroyed before the Second World War, severely weakening early Soviet military readiness. Hyperinflation shattered the Venezuelan economy. The important point is this: these disasters were not random mistakes. They were predictable outcomes of a system that punished truth and rewarded illusion. Stage 5, internal purges and self-destruction. Now we arrive at the final stage, The regime can no longer explain failure honestly. And because dictatorships cannot blame the system itself, they begin blaming people inside the system. This is where paranoia becomes lethal. Under Stalin, officials denounced one another in endless cycles of accusation and purging. Near the end of Hitler's rule, military commanders were executed or removed as trust inside the regime collapsed. Inside Maduro's government, internal surveillance and loyalty testing intensified as instability increased. This creates a perfect self-destruction loop. Distorted information creates misjudgment. Misjudgment creates failed policy. Failed policy creates crisis. Crisis creates paranoia. Paranoia creates purges. And purges destroy the very people capable of saving the system. The regime begins consuming itself from the inside. The deeper psychological truth. Ancient spiritual traditions understood something modern political systems still struggle to accept. Human beings often become trapped inside illusions they create themselves. The more power someone possesses, the more dangerous those illusions become. A dictator eventually reaches 3 psychological conclusions. Nobody can be trusted. Only I can maintain control. If I appear weak, I am finished. But here is the paradox. The harder the leader tries to secure power, the faster he destroys the foundations supporting it. Fear eliminates honesty. Honesty disappears. Reality becomes invisible. And once reality disappears, collapse becomes unavoidable. In the end, dictators are not truly fighting external enemies. They are fighting enemies created by their own fear. That is why, in the final stage, they often destroy the people closest to them first. Because paranoia always moves inward. Final thought. History repeatedly teaches the same lesson. Authoritarian systems rarely collapse because outsiders are too strong. They collapse because the leadership becomes psychologically incapable of confronting reality. The most dangerous prison is not political. It is mental. The moment power fears truth, it begins preparing its own destruction. If this analysis helped you see power, psychology, and history from a different perspective, subscribe and share the channel. Because understanding how civilizations collapse may be one of the most important forms of survival in the modern world.